Hello and welcome to this webinar, Be Prepared to Get Your Next Role. I hope this will be a really useful, if quite short session for you today. The reason I decided to create this webinar is I often find that people get so into their role and their day-to-day job that when they need to look for a new role or an opportunity comes up, it's either a really stressful experience getting ready to go for it, or they simply don't bother. So I really hope this short webinar will help you to think about what you need to be doing to be prepared to get your next role. So for those of you that don't know me already, I'm Joanna Godoyne and I run Inside Out Image, and everything I do is about helping individuals progress their careers and organisations improve their performance. And the way I do this is I work with individuals on their personal impact and relationship management skills. So that means going for a new role. That also includes things like networking, coming across well in meetings, building key relationships, navigating office politics. If you think about any scenario where you need to engage with other people and be positively memorable, those are the sorts of challenges I help both individuals with and groups in organisations, as well as speaking at events. Before I ran Inside Out Image, which has been going for just over 8 years now, I worked in marketing and consultancy. So I've got a lot of experience in those areas as well, which I often find is very useful. So let's get cracking. Today's webinar is about 3 key areas that I believe you need to focus on so you are prepared to get your next role. If you focus on these 3, that will help you a great deal at the point where you do want to start going for new roles. The first point to say is change can't be avoided. We are not always in control of what is happening around us and our circumstances. So whilst right now you might not want a new role, you might be very happy in the one you're in, things can change. I've seen plenty of people who were quite happy in their job, doing really well, things were going the way they wanted, and then there was a change that they weren't expecting. Perhaps it was something as direct as redundancy, or there was a merger, they were acquired, so that meant there was a big culture change, which often brings a lot of change of politics. Perhaps there was a management change, or even more directly, their line manager changed. And it is often said that people leave a boss, not a company. And I've seen that happen a lot. So lots of things can happen to you that you don't always expect. And you might then decide it's time to move on. Of course, you might also decide it's time for a change. You come to the point where you're just not achieving what you want to anymore. There's not an additional opportunity within your company for you. You can't see where you might go next. And so you need to look externally. And what you don't want is when any of these things happens, whether it's your choice or not, that it feels like a really uphill struggle to get a new role, because very often you're still doing a role at the same time. So with my tips today, I hope it will really help you be a bit more prepared so that if you do need to make that change, then it is less painful. The first thing, which if you know me a bit, you would expect me to say, is your network is really, really key. I can't emphasize this enough. There's lots of reasons it's key, but to highlight in terms of this particular topic of looking for a new role, it's a great way to find out about new opportunities. So if you're going to events, you hear about things that are coming up, roles in other organizations. It also gives you ideas of what other roles are available. It's very easy to just carry on moving through and staying in the same kind of role without considering where else you could go and how else you can use your skills. Not necessarily changing industry, but just a different type of role. So it can give you ideas. And of course, getting people to approach you. When people know you, you've built up rapport with them, you've got a strong personal impact, hopefully they will think of you if a suitable opportunity comes up. And of course, we're talking here internal and external networking. Both of those are really important to be doing. If you've read any of my articles about Pi theory, you'll know how important exposure is internally for career success, and of course, networking externally so you get known, so people know who you are and what you can do. Many people now do get roles through their network and also internally as well, if we're thinking about that. And very often, dare I say, the process is simpler if it is via that route, because people already know a bit about you. I'm not saying there won't be interviews, there will be interviews, I'm sure, but it is often a lot easier. So it is worth working on these relationships early on, even when you don't think you're going to want to look for a new role, because you can't build a network when you need one. So my clear advice for this would be to think about what are your objectives, and these are likely to not be related to just getting a new role, but other objectives in your career for thinking about why you might network, who you need to meet, thinking about where they will be, so from an internal and external perspective, and then coming up with a strategy and a plan for your networking. Because if you don't do that, nothing will happen, and you've got nothing to judge against whether what you've done has been worth the time and effort you've made. So really encourage you to have a think about that, and not to overcommit either, because it's very easy to decide you're suddenly going to start going to one internal event a month and a couple of external, and then you don't end up doing any of those three. So start slowly, decide who you need to know, and make sure you build up those networks as well as you can. The next point of my three is your CV. Now, of course, we've all got a CV somewhere. Sometimes people's are sat getting dusty in a corner somewhere. And the point here is it's very hard to update your CV when it is years and years out of date. The reason is we can't remember what we did 1 year ago very well, never mind 5 or 6. So ideally, you would update your CV fairly regularly so that what you're putting is really illustrating what you've been doing, the value you've added, and the skills you've developed and used on there. And I would recommend you do this every 3 months. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but just have a look at it every 3 months and see if there's anything worth adding to make sure it's just up to date with who you are and what you've done. Some points on key things about your CV, if you need to sit down now and get it to a good base level, is really consider what is relevant, what really needs to be on there now. I looked at a CV of a very experienced person recently who's worked in banking for nearly 20 years, and her GCSE grades and subjects were still on there. And I would say at this point that's really not relevant, and it's taking up unnecessary space. So think about what's relevant. Be really careful about using jargon. If you are certain you're going to be applying for the same sort of roles, jargon can be fine, but you don't want people to not understand what you mean. And particularly if you might be using internal terms, have a think about that. You need people to be really clear about what you've done, what you've achieved. So taking an objective step back and thinking about that is important. The summary at the top of who you are and what you've actually done, that needs to bring you to life and be really clear as well. Fundamentally, your CV needs to have hooks in it that make people want to see you and ask more. I do a lot of work with clients on their CVs. I call it CV reinvention, the process I go through. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is provoke interest. So do the reassurance piece that my client's an experienced person, they've achieved lots of things, but also some hooks to get potential employers, recruiters interested in seeing the person, because that's where the opportunities come. A couple of practical tips, really. Make sure your CV is not too long. Even if you've had a long career, I would try and keep it to 2 pages if you can. People just get bored, and also if you can't be concise. So really think about what needs to be there and how can you communicate the messages most powerfully. And lastly, it sounds really basic, but get someone to proofread it for you. It's not good to have typos on your CV, and it's very easy to do when we've written something ourselves and we're used to reading it. Our eyes almost skip over that. So make sure if you are starting to think about submitting that, someone else is reviewing it for you. So the third and final point, which you'd expect me to say, I'm sure, if you know anything about me, is LinkedIn. LinkedIn is no longer a nice to have. It's really essential that you are on there. So if people have met you in person, they can go and find you on there, and also find you just through searches as well, which is particularly important when you come to look for a new role. So similar to your CV, make sure your profile on there is kept really up to date. Make sure it looks good. It shouldn't just have a download of your whole CV on there. There's some picking and choosing to be done between what goes on there versus your CV. Few key things to think about. Make sure you've got a really good professional headshot on there that's really clear and engaging. Think about your summary, which is the larger piece near the top that talks about you and your career, and also your headline, which is just under your photo. Those things are really important. And think about the words you might want to be found for in searches in those. Think about your last few roles, make sure there's some information on what you've actually done in each of those. And importantly, build up your connections, because when you've got more connections, you'll show more in searches and algorithms, which is essential. You want people to go and find you by name, and you want to come up in searches, as I said. So it's important to work on your visibility on LinkedIn. Now, you don't have to spend ages on there like I do because I run a business, but I'd say 15 minutes a couple of times a week is really good use of your time. You can even do that if you've got the app whilst you're waiting for the bus or sat in a coffee shop, just to engage with others' content, whether you like, share, or comment. Quick piece of advice on that: always make sure you read something fully before you do any of those things. Also, spend some time when you do this checking any messages that you've received or connection requests. And the big thing about connection requests is people often ignore the recruiters when they're not looking for a role. Now, there's no doubt there can be some annoyances there, but what I'd say is look at the recruiter that's inviting you and think if they could ever be helpful for you. And if they can, I'd accept, but send them a message saying that you're not looking for anything now. Because then that's a lot easier when you come to look for a role if you've already got some recruiters you're connected to. So I'd really recommend that you do that. You might even want to post something on LinkedIn as well, not just sharing others' content. You might want to write an article on your area of expertise or post about an event you've been to or something else. LinkedIn is an excellent way to psychologically stay in contact with people from networking that you've met, even if you've not seen them or emailed them or spoken to them recently. I'm not saying you shouldn't do any of those things, but for the other people that you don't do that with, it's a great way to stay in contact. And certainly you should be connecting with people on LinkedIn after you've met them at networking. So definitely spend some time on your profile and make sure that's kept up to date in line with your CV. So those were the three key points I wanted to give you today to get you started. I'd really encourage you work on those a bit now, have a think about them, what you need to be doing, make some plans. If you feel that you are ready to get going and that you might want to look for a new role very soon, then you might benefit from a free career booster conversation with me. You'll see my email address on the slide there. If you'd like to book one of those, half an hour conversation, no obligation at all, please email me to do that. If you're thinking you just want to hone some of your career skills, and that includes getting a new role and networking's in there as well, then you may like to sign up for my 9 Neglected Skills for Career Success email series. And there's also a booklet offered at the end that's free, that captures all those 9 skills, and it's packed full of tips and advice. So that might help you to get going, to start reading that. You'll see there's a couple of other suggestions on the slide as well. Of course, connect with me on social media. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn and also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So feel free to follow me on any of those places, and do get in touch if you've got any questions. Thank you very much for joining me.